Let's start with Ukraine.
Okay.
I've seen or I'm sure we've all seen the White House statement and the Secretary's statement
Yes.
on this, both of which are, well, as you know, they welcome it, but say the proof is in the pudding, essentially, and that it needs to be implemented. I am just wondering, though, if the administration is comfortable with everything that's in this agreement, particularly the ceasefire lines, which do not appear to match the ones in the previous Minsk agreement.
Well, I hope you did all see the Secretary's statement. It just went out, so if you haven't seen it, it should be in your inboxes. One of the points he made in his statement is that the parties have a long road ahead before achieving peace and the full restoration of Ukraine's sovereignty. And so while the first test and the first step here is the ceasefire, which according to the agreement will be put in place this weekend, there's a great deal of work to be done. As you know, and has been reported, there are reports of, which we're still reviewing the agreement, but there are reports of discussions that will be ongoing about addressing the border questions over the course of the coming months. Obviously, we, as the Secretary indicated in his statement, have offered our help and services and our willingness to participate and support these ongoing efforts. But as was also noted in the statements, the proof is in the pudding. I don't think that's an exact quote, but our view is that words are words and actions and implementation are what we're looking for. So a piece of paper is a piece of paper until it's implemented.
Right, but are you comfortable with everything that's in this piece of paper right now? In other words, if it is implemented, and I know that's a big if everyone agrees to it, are you okay with it, considering the fact that it appears that it gives the separatists more territory than the previous Minsk
Well, there are
agreement?
some components in the immediate ceasefire where they're expected to pull back from certain lines, and the reasoning for that is to have peace, right, as soon as this is implemented, which we certainly support as a first step. There are components of this which we'll have to continue to evaluate that still need to be determined. We're still studying what it is. We'll still be discussing it with our partners. So we support the overall effort, and I think we'll continue to assess in the days ahead.
All right, and then my last one on the Secretary's statement says, as we have long said, the U.S. is prepared to consider rolling back sanctions on Russia when the Minsk agreements of September 2014 and now this agreement are fully implemented. And then it lays out the conditions for the rolling back of sanctions. That includes full ceasefire, withdrawal of all foreign troops, equipment from Ukraine, the full restoration of Ukrainian control of the international border, and release of all hostages. I don't see the word Crimea in there at all. Is that, are you basically conceding Crimea?
We continue to believe that Crimea is a part of Ukraine. That remains our policy. We're talking about our policy as it relates to these sanctions. There's a long road ahead, and we don't anticipate that all of these pieces will be implemented in the coming days. We're certainly hopeful that it will be done rapidly.
Okay, sorry, I said that was the last, but I have one more.
Go
and
ahead.
That is, there has been a lot of talk about the possibility or the administration's consideration of supplying Kiev with lethal defensive weapons, and also a lot of talk about imposing new, more tough or tougher sanctions against Russia. Is it fair to say that those two things right now, while they still may be being considered, are on hold until you see what happens with the implementation of this agreement?
Well, I think we have not taken options off the table. Those discussions are ongoing. So a decision hasn't been made. Certainly, our preference would be to see this agreement and components, including a ceasefire, including the pullback of heavy weapons and a complete withdrawal of foreign fighters implemented. And obviously, that would impact, and we'd correlate our actions accordingly. But discussions are ongoing internally and with our European partners.
But until the ceasefire comes into place on Sunday or Saturday, Sunday, I guess, and you have been able to judge whether or not the agreement has been abided by, can we expect to see you take steps, sanctions, or a possible decision on the weapons before you know whether or not this is this agreement is successful?
I think you can expect we'll see if this agreement can be implemented, but I'm not going to put a timeline or exact criteria on how we'll evaluate that. Obviously, it will be clear if it's being implemented or not, specifically with the ceasefire.
Jen, is the US and Europe still prepared to move ahead with sanctions, even though this agreement has been made?
Well, I think, Leslie, we've seen the agreement. It was only made in the last few hours. Obviously, we're continuing to consult and discuss with our European partners the specifics of it. And certainly, as you know, we've long supported the diplomatic path as the right path forward. However, as I just noted, but it's worth repeating, an agreement is a piece of paper unless it's implemented. And so what we've seen to date is that Russia and Russian-backed separatists have not taken the steps to implement. We will see what they do from here. We have had long ongoing conversations with our European partners about additional steps that could be taken. And if it's not implemented or there's additional aggression, that's something we will continue to discuss.
So would it be best to maybe pause on those sanctions while to make sure that President Putin keeps to his, the US was not part of this deal.
But we supported it and we were consulted on it and we continue to consult on it and we support the effort.
Would sanctions not be a way to continue applying pressure?
Well, we maintain the ability and the resources to put additional sanctions in place should the situation on the ground warrant it.
Can I ask in what ways practically is the United States willing to help? There was some suggestion perhaps that there might be a need for more OSCE monitors, for instance. Is that something the United States would be prepared to do?
I think obviously the United States has shown, and we have shown, that we are not just supportive in words, but supportive in actions of returning the sovereignty and the respect of the territorial integrity to the people and the government of Ukraine. I don't have anything to lay out for you specifically. I think that's a discussion we'll have with our partners and with the Ukrainians about what their needs are.
And can I just ask, why is the United States not involved in the negotiations that were happening in Minsk? Did you not feel that you had a role in those?
I think as you know, the Secretary visited Ukraine just last week. He met with Chancellor Merkel. He's had consultations and conversations with his French and German counterparts as well. We've been very closely coordinated and consulted on these ongoing efforts. We have been involved in the past in some negotiations and some we have not been. It's not about what our role is. It's about what is in the best interest of the people of Ukraine, the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, and we support any diplomatic effort that takes steps forward toward achieving that goal.
But it does seem that the United States, which usually has quite a diplomatic weight in many of these issues around the world, whether it's from Ukraine to Syria or Iraq, has been sidestepped in this case.
I would disagree with that, Joe. We haven't been involved in the trilateral contact group negotiations over the course of the last several months. We've closely consulted on them. At the same time, while those have been ongoing, we've partnered and worked with our European counterparts to put in place sanctions, to take coordinating steps, and that's ongoing. It simply doesn't reflect how we feel about this effort.
Is your understanding that the sanctions will not be lifted until the Russians pull out of Crimea?
Well, there are specific steps that are laid out that I'm happy to repeat, including the complete withdrawal of all heavy weapons and foreign fighters from Ukraine, the restoration to Kyiv of control of its side of the border with Russia, full and unfettered access by international monitors to separatist-controlled territory. It's outlined in the Minsk agreement, and it's outlined in the specifics here. So that's what we're looking at. That needs to be implemented, and obviously that's our primary focus at this point in time.
Russians don't pull out of Crimea, no sanctions will be lifted.
I think I just answered that question.
Let me just ask you very quickly. You said something about foreign fighters. Are there any other foreign fighters other than Russians?
That's primarily who we're talking about here, Saeed, not U.S. Let's finish Ukraine. Go ahead.
I just want to make clear that although Crimea is not in this agreement, this agreement doesn't cover Crimea. The fact of the matter is the administration put sanctions and the EU put sanctions on Russia after the annexation. And I want to make sure that in Secretary Kerry's statement that talks about rolling back sanctions if Russia complies with the Minsk agreement, that does not include the sanctions that were imposed because of the Crimea
Well, Matt,
annexation.
we haven't even made a decision to roll back any sanctions. So I expect if these pieces are implemented, we'll have a discussion about what sanctions would be rolled back.
Are you saying that it is possible then that you would roll back the Crimea sanctions based on this agreement, which does not include Crimea?
Matt, I think I'm not going to lay out what sanctions we're going to roll back on a plan that has not even begun to be implemented.
Well, yeah, but the problem is that when you say that you don't accept Crimea as the annexation of Crimea by Russia, you impose sanctions on them. Are you now opening the door to dropping that?
I didn't drop anything. I'm just not
So the
outlining
Crimea
what
sanctions. So even if this agreement holds, everyone abides by it. There's peace and stability in eastern Ukraine. The Crimea sanctions will remain in place until that issue is resolved or
when
not.
everything is implemented, I'm happy to have a discussion about what is rolled back and why. We're far from that point at this
And
point.
then just the question was asked: has the U.S. been sidestepped? Was there back in June in Normandy? Was there any serious discussion or serious desire by the administration to become part of the Normandy format, the Normandy group?
If I recall 7 or 8 months ago, I guess that
Right.
was at this point, we were also supportive of those efforts and expected to be consulted and continue our coordination, and we have.
And you would say that you do not have any complaints about how the French and the Germans in particular went about doing this?
We've worked with them throughout this process.
But you
and
don't feel left out?
We do not. We do not. Our objective is about Ukraine and the future of Ukraine.
But I guess it's not a question about whether you feel out, it's about left out. It's about a question about the absence of the weight of US diplomacy being at the table.
Well, I would refute the notion that there's been an absence. We were in Ukraine. The secretary was in Ukraine first last week. We have been engaged closely with the Ukrainians and with our European partners in the form of meetings and phone calls up to the highest levels over the past couple days. The president has been engaged with many partners. So I just don't think that that's an accurate depiction of what's been happening.
There hasn't been any high-level face-to-face meetings between President Putin and the United States for some time now.
That's correct.
Does that not hamper your diplomacy?
Okay,
No,
There
but
was-
face-to-face. There
Well,
hasn't
the
been
president spoke with him about 2 days ago.
Yeah, but there hasn't been a face-to-face sort of sit-down with President Putin for some time between high-level American officials.
Correct.
Does that not point to the fact that your diplomacy is somehow being stymied with Russia at the moment?
I don't think it does. We've had, again, phone calls. The secretary met with Foreign Minister Lavrov about 5 days ago. We've been engaged with the Russians on a range of levels.
And if you actually look, I mean, the Germans, almost every other country said that this offers a glimmer of hope. In your mind, is anything in this deal that you believe that this one could be this one has more chance of working?
Have the it factor.
Have the it factor.
I'm not sure what that means, even though I repeated it. But
You knew what I meant.
Do you mean does it
What
offer
makes
a
this
chance
one
forward, or you tell me what you mean?
Yes, that's exactly what I meant. Was that what is it in this one that you think? Is it the timing of it? I mean, have the sides exhausted, all options here? What is it that I mean, do you believe that this one has a chance of succeeding? Or is it
Well,
too early?
the truth is, we will see, and we are clear-eyed about the potential here. We have seen the Russians say one thing and do another over the course of the last several months. The first test of whether this agreement lays the groundwork for a more comprehensive settlement is the run-up to the ceasefire, and I think we'll all know more after we see what happens this weekend.
India?
No.
Let's finish Ukraine. Go ahead.
Does the administration believe that its public floating of the idea of supplying Kiev with weapons had anything to do with the rapidity with which the French and with which the Russians presented a plan? The French and Germans countered it. There was this flurry of meetings, and now this agreement in Minsk.
I can't attribute, I think the French and the Germans certainly have been engaged from the beginning, and we all saw the increase in violence and what was happening on the ground in Ukraine. I can assure you I would give yourselves and your colleagues a bit more credit than to suggest it was a public floating, given it was information that got out about internal discussions. So I don't believe that was
That wasn't intentionally put out there by the administration?
not by those who are making decisions in the administration.
Well, you're saying it's true, though. I mean, the idea that it is being considered is not wrong.
No, not. Nor was I saying it was wrong, but it wasn't an intentional
So it's a
public floating.
complete coincidence.
Well, I think, as you know, as all of you are reporters, and you tell
All right.
me, you
Okay.
often do reporting and find out information about what's being
It's
discussed.
not a bad cop, good cop decision. The Europeans being the good cop, ready to negotiate. The Americans being the bad cop, ready to send in weapons.
Are we the bad cops now? Well, that's. I think this is. Obviously, there are internal discussions that have been ongoing for some time about what the appropriate steps are. As all of you know, we take into account what happens on the ground. We've seen the increase in violence over the last several weeks, the increased aggression. That obviously leads up to consider a range of options, which we've talked about a bit in here. In terms of the French and German efforts, I would suspect they've seen the same increase in violence on the ground, and we've been engaged with them. We all were recognizing that the Minsk protocols were not being implemented, and we needed to see what the diplomatic path forward could be.
Would you say that your position became closer to that of the Germans and the French through after the shuttle diplomacy, not the shuttle diplomacy, the high-level diplomacy by Angela Merkel and visiting?
I'm not sure what
so
you mean.
quickly?
In
What I
our
mean
position on what?
the deal became more real and more within reach right after her trip to Washington.
I wouldn't say that's an accurate depiction of what happened. We have long supported the Minsk Agreement and the principles in the Minsk Agreement. These discussions were based on that. There was agreement that we needed to look for every avenue for a diplomatic path forward. The French and the Germans led that effort. We coordinated with them. It was discussed not just on Monday, but over the weekend with Chancellor Merkel, in discussions and meetings in the region, in Europe, over the weekend. So that's what happened. Oh, okay, go ahead.
The issue of the sanctions
Sure.
and the lethal weapons. Given that there is the ceasefire and you want to give this a chance, on the sanctions, and surely you would not be thinking about those things right now while this diplomatic effort is being given a chance.
Well, there's always ongoing discussions about what the appropriate assistance is and what the appropriate response is. I would remind you that we're talking about starting the ceasefire in 2 days from now. So I don't have anything to predict for you, but I think it's safe to assume we're supporting this effort. We certainly want to see it work, and that's our priority and our preference. But we have a range of options that we continue to consider.
And then I have a follow-up. You probably saw today was a $40 billion deal package, including IMF and other money for Ukraine. Is the US willing to support that additional money within the IMF and the other parts of it?
Well, we welcome the news that the government of Ukraine and the IMF have reached an agreement that will allow the IMF to provide Ukraine with a $17.5 billion, I think that's the number I had, Leslie, but in financial assistance in support of economic reforms. As IMF Managing Director Lagarde noted, this is ambitious and not without risk. It will require the Ukrainian government to continue implementation of tough reforms to fight corruption, overhaul the energy sector, cut expenditures, and reduce bureaucracy. We, in coordination with our European partners, will continue our assistance to help Ukraine implement these quickly and build a stronger, more prosperous, democratic future. Certainly, as you know, because you, I think, covered the IMF, it was the decision of the IMF. We certainly supported these efforts and will, help support efforts toward reform that are required by the agreement.
You mentioned about the monitoring of this agreement and how you're willing to help. It's OSCE led,
The
I think,
OSCE
right?
is, yes.
And it's going to be monitoring both sides
Yes.
for violations
Yes.
of this. You've made pretty clear, the administration has made clear that if the Russians and the separatists don't agree, the costs, there will be consequences for them, and the cost to Russia will increase, right? So, which is new sanctions, basically. What is there any consequence or any cost to Ukraine if they're the ones found to be not complying with the agreement?
Well, Matt, first of all, if we've seen over the last 24 hours even that Russia has continued to take aggressive actions into Ukraine, even while this agreement is being discussed. So Ukraine, over the past several months, has not only implemented and taken steps to implement the Minsk protocols, but they have been supportive of efforts to find a peaceful solution here. I don't think we anticipate that is going to happen over the course of the coming months.
Right, but I mean, if, since you're willing to entertain the possibility that the rebels and the Russians aren't going to agree with it and there'll be cost for it, can you not also entertain the possibility that there will be cost to the government in Kiev if they are found to be not to be in violation?
Well, that's just a little
that-
bit ludicrous, given Ukraine
Okay.
is a sovereign country, and this is a country that has illegally brought troops, weapons, resources into their country. Certainly, we call on both sides to abide by it,
Right.
but I don't think, I think that's a highly unlikely hypothetical.
Well, I mean, it may be, but I'm not sure it rises to the level of ludicrous, because if you're talking about both sides needing to implement it, and there's going to be, but now it seems to me that you're saying that there won't be consequences if one certain side doesn't implement.
Matt, over the last 6 months, Ukraine has implemented the Minsk protocols, whereas Russia has not. So I
Okay,
think that's
but
the record we're looking at.
All right.
Ukraine, or we